Hello. So, Greg, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be with you this morning.
Well, the pleasure's all ours, and of course, we're here to talk about the incredible, the sensational Emotion by Design. How does it feel to have the book? I watched an amazing unboxing video of you on LinkedIn. How does it feel to have the book in your hands and to know that it's so close to hitting the shelves?
Yeah, it is quite a feeling when you see it live for the first time because for the last year and a half, everything's been through uh, Zoom, reviewing through emails and texts. And when you finally see it as a living, breathing entity, if you will, it's a quite extraordinary feeling. So I definitely wanted to show that share that with everybody. And I'm excited to put that out in the world because I think a lot of what I talk about within the book is what I do feel brands and marketers and quite frankly the world needs. And so hopefully people find it as a useful playbook, if you will, on how a brand can play a larger role in the world and the lives of its consumers.
Absolutely, and yeah, I've had the pleasure of reading that already, and it is just packed to the rafters with your incredible stories of the last 28 years of doing that at Nike. So I wanted to jump straight in and ask you if you could tell us just one story which sums up your time and your career at Nike, what would it be?
Yeah, well, it is a great question, and that's why I start with my last official project at Nike and kind of bring the reader into what that process was like, and that was the Colin Kaepernick True to Seven campaign. Because at my retirement party, I received a large portrait of Colin Kaepernick from the photographer Platon, who's just an amazing talent. And it symbolized what that journey was to bring that particular campaign to market, a campaign that could have just been, a typical product campaign, right? Big shot of whatever that product is with a headline. But we chose to do something special with Colin Kaepernick to represent his values and the platform and cause that he cares about, which is fighting racial injustice and then but also empowering an audience not only by inspiring them through these photos but through those values kind of breaking those down so that they too could kind of see the insights with through the eyes of Colin and live that as well and go on that journey and that movement to create a more equitable world. So it's really that last part of the journey that serves as a springboard to what I currently do now in my capacity as an advisor, an instructor, and now an author. So
Amazing, thank you. And yeah, what a way to kick things off. The book begins so impactfully. What a story to tell! And all the way through the book, you share these stories and experiences that you've had moving from an intern initially at Nike to a designer to a marketer, and you share how those lessons and ideas that you picked up along the way can be part of a framework which can help to create work that really makes us feel something. So I wondered why you were moved to share these lessons and to write and publish Emotion by Design now.
I think there's two reasons. One is there is the relationship between brands and their audiences, I believe, is becoming very automated. And it's very data and analytics driven. And there's a lot of great things that have come out of all the machine learning and technology we have at our fingertips as marketers, right? We're able to deliver, more productivity with our marketing. We're able to deliver faster with more velocity to stay up to the pace of the consumer's, dreams and needs. But at the same time, I believe we've squeezed out a lot of the art within marketing. And it's the art and creativity that really drives the emotional attachments that brands have with consumers and consumers have with brands, right? And when you're a brand that is able to generate those feelings within your audience, I also believe it has a direct impact on your ability to lead beyond selling products and transactions, and that you can actually play a greater role in the world and in the role within the consumers' lives. And I think you've seen that. I just happen to work at a brand like Nike um, that always took a stand on the cultural issues of the time. And they always did it in an authentic way through the lens of sport. But they were able to move people together as a collective to really, I believe, make change within the world in a positive way. But again, you can only really achieve that if you're going beyond transactions and truly creating relationships. And relationships are driven by emotions. And so there's only so far this digital arena and ecosystem that we now live within as marketers can take us, right? Before you start eroding the brand equity that you've built up over time. So it was really important for me as someone who started really as an artist and a designer before entering into the marketing world, to use this as a call to action, especially coming out of the pandemic, where if you're a young marketer, it may be all you do know is data driven marketing, and you haven't been within a culture shoulder to shoulder with others on how you can create work that, as I said before, you dare to be remembered, and the work is creates the kind of impact in a consumer's life that they never forget on that. So yeah, I mean, it's in the spirit of just do it. That's exactly what I set out to do, and I'm just so thankful that I had a world-class team around me that was able to help me on that journey.
Absolutely. And as you say, it feels so prevalent right now, coming out of the pandemic and coming out of the siloed working from home and not being in that creative environment of a team. And, the subtitle of the book is Creative Leadership Lessons from a Life at Nike. And I guess the question I wanted to ask is, and you answer it through the book, but you provide this playbook for unleashing creativity within teams. How, as a creative leader, can you balance providing direction and expectations and KPIs and objectives whilst also providing the flexibility and freedom that creativity needs to thrive?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? And it's one of the reasons in the book I use the Brazil national team, the football team, as the ultimate example of course, having a structure and a playbook in terms of how they play, but it allows the individuality of each player to really rise to the surface. And so, if you watch them play, and one of the reasons why they become the world's favorite team, right, is because there's a lot of spontaneity to their offense. And just like creatives, they may drive you mad at some points, right? But in the end, there's a reason that Brazil has 5 World Cups, right? The only 5 World Cup winner. And so I took a lot of inspiration over the years of watching that team and their success, but it was the way they were successful and how, literally the creative eccentricities of each individual were allowed to flourish. And I think that's the difference between managing and coaching a creative team. You know, Sometimes managing a creative team, you end up just simply creating uniformity. You remove the edges and everybody ends up in the middle. Whereas I think if you're coaching, yes, you have to have structure and deadlines and budget management, and you have to reduce the variables, because if you're just simply looking at a white sheet of paper and asked to create, it's a lonely place, right? So your job is to make sure that you have the right variables available. But um, yeah, I just think that you have to learn to incentivize risk, because creative types often don't are allergic to the status quo, right? And they look to disrupt whatever the conventional approach is at the time. And so, how at the end of the day, this is a business that we work in. So, what I often subscribe to is making sure that outside of your your daily minute by minute real time brand offense, that you're also creating space and a platform for individuals to dream. And not only the space, but there's a forum where they can share ideas. It could be once a quarter, it could be once a year, where they're able to exercise their imagination, maybe outside of what is becoming, right? Just given the digital commerce offense that so many brands run, it's all consuming. So I just think if you truly want to be a brand that innovates with great velocity, that brings ideas into the world that no one's seen before, you have to create the space to do that. And creative types often, I'm asked, like, how could you stay at a corporation for so long? Which oftentimes is the antithesis of an environment that would celebrate, promote, and cultivate a creative culture. And I just happened to find my way into a brand that really was built on entrepreneurship and innovation. Right? I mean, the co-founder created the waffle outsole with a waffle iron. I
Yeah.
mean, imagine working at a place where that's like front and center. Or the fact that the greatest Nike innovation arguably is Nike Air, and the fact that that actually came from work that was being done in NASA for space exploration around astronaut helmets. So this is what you're surrounded in, and that's why oftentimes it's you mentioned this. It really is important to not only have a set of principles and guides, if you will, but and symbols of innovation excellence, but you have to be immersed in an environment as well, and that is as innovative as the solutions that you seek to put out in the world. And that's been tough, right? In this virtual hybrid world we've worked in. With that said, there's a lot of great things about this virtual world, because in some ways it's allowed more. There's more ways to contribute, right? Sometimes in a physical environment, only the loudest voices are heard, right? And quite frankly, sometimes those loud voices are just simply loud.
Absolutely.
So I just think for the introverts out there, the last 2 years has maybe allowed through some other ways of communicating what you believe, through chat features, through other ways to engage within a team that's more comfortable to you. That's one of the things I've seen over time. Obviously, I'm an instructor of branding at the University of Oregon's Graduate School of Business. And I've taught in person and I've taught online, right? And both have their benefits. I do think what the online universe allows for is to bring a community together from all over the world that isn't bound by proximity, physical proximity, as well as individuals who communicate in different ways and sometimes with different languages. Imagine if English isn't your first language. It can be quite intimidating to participate in a brainstorm or a critique, to stand up there on that. And so, again, this is all a work in progress. And so I'm very excited to participate in the future of creative learning, if you will. over the next year and how we kind of integrate these two spheres.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for that. And I think that's one of the things that I love the most about the book is that you do share these experiences that have spanned this, multi-decade career, but the lessons feel so pervasive right now, and we don't have these frameworks for how to no we haven't navigated a global pandemic before as creatives and marketers and everything in between, and it just feels so important to acknowledge the importance of creativity and teamwork right now. So thank you for writing it.
Well, no, I appreciate that. And I do believe one of the great, uh, you know, there's so many challenges today, but one thing that's come out of this is far more empathy for for the teams and the individuals within the teams, and seeing and hearing and feeling them in a deeper, more meaningful way. And I talk about this a lot in the book. Given my background, I really grew up as an outsider. I'm biracial. I'm half black, half white. I'm also adopted, and so I grew up in a white community in an all white school system. And so I grew up as an outsider, but I also grew up as an observer, someone who was very curious and also, empathetic about others that I saw that were also outsiders, and being able to bring my individual perspective and experience into the workplace at a place like Nike from day one was quite powerful. And I was able to bring that into the work. And I talk about that with the Colin Kaepernick work, speaking of an individual that didn't separate his personal self from his professional self. And so there's parallels with, I think, having more sensitivity to, um, what, and not only sensitivity to an individual's experience and perspective, but using that as fuel for the innovation and creative process. Diversity of race, gender, thought, perspective, experience is so important to the art of innovation, right? And it's now more than ever. And I think that's part of the message of writing this book in a way of illustrating these experiences through my own journey was really important because it's the best thing I could do to illustrate what diversity means, brought to life within the workplace.
And the way that you would have approached any of the campaigns that you've done throughout your career at Nike is to center the people, to center the personality and the story behind the athlete. And it feels very true to that way of thinking as well. To talk about something which I feel like I have to talk about, which is the fact that during your time at Nike, you were responsible for the iconic brand logo, the swoosh. Um, in the book, you do share, and rightly so, that of course the logo is just one element in a brand's toolbox. So I wondered if you could share your principles for building and maintaining a whole distinctive brand identity.
Yeah, great question. And certainly, just I was part of a unique brand because if you look at the brand elements, when I walked into the door, and certainly walked into that position, that first broad management position as head of brand design, it was a pretty big responsibility if you think about it, because the swoosh is not just a logo or a trademark. That is, the swoosh has become a symbol of human potential, right? All that equity that's built into that mark, that signature, seeing that mark all over the world on the fields of play and the tracks and the basketball courts, all of that is infusing that mark with emotion, right? So it was big. And then also with Just Do It. Just Do It isn't just a slogan, right? Just Do It is a state of mind, and really an approach that people have adopted as a lifestyle. So back to your point, it's like, for me, it early on in my career, way back when, I was very obsessed with visual communication and the visual side of managing a brand identity and creating that and building that. And really, my own maturity was realizing that that's only part of the equation. And what you're really managing are these emotional symbols, these elements that really have the power to stir emotions, just as a great ad or image would, right? So when it comes to things like color, like the Nike orange, just like the Tiffany blue or the Burberry pattern, these are hard to achieve, but the brands that have, as what I like to call, that incredible frame that all of their pictures sit within, right? The stories you want to tell are going to be far more powerful the stronger your brand frame is. And that brand frame is your brand identity, and it starts with elements like your logo and your brand colors, and just even the way Apple uses the absence of information, right? And the use of white space, and Apple's whole approach to the reduction and subtraction of information. So you're only seeing what's essential. But guess what? Um, they never remove the soul and the personality from their work. And one of my favorite quotes, by he wasn't talking about marketing, but Albert Einstein said, make it as simple as possible, but not simpler. And that's the point. You're taking things down to the essential, but you're not removing the meaning, the deep meaning from it, so that it still has that emotive power. So back to your question, all this is great, but without standards and guidelines, especially for global brands that you can't be everywhere around the world ensuring that everything is applied in the perfect way, especially with how the role of digital engagement works now. So it's not only creating those brand elements, but it's having a level of standards, brand standards, style guides, and then a level of respect by everyone in your brand, right? And that's the thing that Nike had, from all employees, about these elements, right? And they need to be protected as such, because it takes years to build all that positive brand equity, but it only takes a few moments to remove it. So very, very important. And lastly, I would say I just have a big passion, because that's where I got my start, as I said, as a graphic design intern, way back in the day. I don't want to age myself here, uh, but so I find myself still, when I go, I don't care if I'm at a grocery store or a hardware store, wherever I am, I'm always looking at examples, good and bad, of packaging, of branding, of brand identity, and of course, in my own instruction at school, as well as advising startups, it's how you start, just really, really is going to determine your success. And I think building a strong foundation and frame for your brand, conceptually and visually, is just really, really important.
Thank you so much. And I think the example of walking around the grocery store is such a good one, because good design when you see it, even if you can't put your finger on exactly what it is. And looking for the good and the bad is a good way to refine your understanding, I think.
That you're exactly right, and that's what I'm trying to do, is have I do think there's some fundamentals that it can at least get young brands on the right track, right? And it goes hand in hand with having a strong brand plan or brand house, right? You can't really start a brand unless you're clear on what your belief is, why you exist in the world, what your mission and vision are, where you're going, and how are you going to get there. And of course, your brand values. It's like, what are those characteristics and traits that make you who you are? And then finally, who you serve. Who is that consumer? Like you must have. That's why I call it a brand house. It's your foundation and it's your North Star. And so you need that, and at the same time you need the elements to a strong brand identity to start as well. And if you have spent the time, and again, it's version 1.0, if you're a startup, if you spent the time on those two bodies of work, you have a much better chance of long-term success than if you had not done that work.
So you talk about knowing your consumer and the power of brand identity, and obviously we acknowledge now that brands have the ability to create these really powerful cultural moments, and as you said at the beginning of this conversation, to actually cause societal change and impact society. Um, but an interesting point that you share in the book is that actually so much of what defines a cultural moment is defined by the consumer themselves, and brands actually don't have too much control over that. So through campaigns like the Wings poster and Find Your Greatness and The Last Game, what was your approach at Nike to creating something that you believed could become a culturally iconic moment?
Yeah, it is a great question. And, ultimately, to your point, it's a fleeting pursuit if you stand up at the beginning of the creative process and say, we're going to create a cultural icon. It's not up to you. There are so many things you can do to have a greater probability of that happening, but that can't be the point. And that's why I talk about this idea of don't chase cool. Because if you chase cool, cool's not going to find you. And quite frankly, the consumer is going to know that that's what you're trying to do, right? And you see that a lot, certainly within this fast-paced culture where there's a lot of pressure to create those viral moments. And so for us, it all comes back to authenticity. Authenticity is your cultural currency in the world. And if you think about those campaigns that you mentioned, before we started to think about how they would resonate in the most contemporary way, right, in terms of how we expressed the idea, we always searched for what was the unique insight beyond observations and assumptions. Like, what truth are we going to hold up in a way and reveal where people stand back and say, wow. And they could stand back and say, well, I knew that, but wow, now that you've said it this way through the lens of sport, I am ready to roll. Or they could say, I never saw it that way. And so it starts with defining what that truth is and going beyond what everybody always knows. And that's why, if you think about Find Your Greatness, the London Olympics in 2012, the world was locked in to watch the London Olympics. And a creative director at Wieden Kennedy came in the room early on in the process when we were trying to figure out what direction we were going to take with a campaign that would launch during the London Olympics. And he said, done some research, and there are, about roughly 25 different towns and cities around the world that are also called London. And in those towns, there's lots of people pursuing their own version of the Olympics, if you will, and their own version of greatness. And so rather than focus on the elite athletes in that moment, let's take the opportunity to remind people that they have greatness within them, that everybody has a level of athleticism that needs to be unlocked. And it's that kind of insightful reveal and the authenticity comes from, you know, bringing that story to life through the platform of sport, where people come, you know, it starts to build and become a story that's shared over and over. And ultimately, that's the point. It's like at some point, it's no longer your. If something is really to become um, a part of culture, in some ways, it no longer belongs to the brand. It's just like the Air Max is such a hot shoe and has been in London. At some point, it belongs to the community, right? And that's an amazing thing to achieve as a brand. And certainly over my time at Nike, there were so many different products and pieces of communication and stories that really, you know, in some ways transcended sport and the brand, and did become part of, you know, the culture on that. And so, yeah, it's like you can't set out to say, well, we're going to create something that's going to have incredible street status, um, versus you have to do the hard work up front to really think about. And if obviously if it's product design, it's like, well, what is the true benefit that you're bringing into the world that's going to improve people's lives, and then through curiosity and inspiration, there are a variety of points in a given time of cultural trends and currents that you can draw from in terms of how you want to express those stories. But it can't start there necessarily. And of course, Isabelle, the toughest thing now is you really have to be thinking about the medium and the message simultaneously. There can be no handoffs. Like your teams have to be so integrated now because of the speed at which everything's moving. And so that's another layer of today. It's this idea of, you know, as you've heard before, this idea of radical creative collaboration, and the fact that everyone is sitting together and sharing energy and building on each other's ideas. And it's, as I talk about in the book, you know, it's, there can be no long passes on the field of creativity, because you really need you know, someone who's an expert in media, or an expert art director, or a UX designer, or a brand strategist, or a researcher. But everybody's got to move together because there isn't time to wait. And I would say the barriers to being successful today, of course, is well, one is having a culture of where you have to ask for permission to come up with ideas. Having a culture of waiting for approvals. I mean, that's just not that's just not going to happen. But I think there's a lot of things that can happen inside of a team structure that will allow it to move with speed and agility, but at the same time deliver really surprising and transformative concepts into the world.
And it comes back to the point that you've raised a few times, and is pervasive throughout all of your work and the book, that you have to also have the right people in the room. And that's not just the right people from an experience perspective and a job role, but from that diversity of thought, the people who are living the culture right now, who represent the customer and represent the whole range of customers. I think that was for me, it was the most emotional thing that I took from the book, is that Nike has always prided itself on having the people in the room who know what's happening right now, and letting different voices be heard. And that's something that we need more and more of in society in general. And I think that's why the campaigns land the way that they do.
Yeah, really, really great point. It's really hard to represent underserved individuals and communities outside of a brand if they're not represented inside the brand. And I wanted to make that really, really clear, but make sure I was showing versus telling, you know, through my own experience. And, you know, as you'll see, I constantly go back to empathy and curiosity as, you know, two of the most important traits that companies and agencies have to embrace within their culture. Because if you do that, then what I talk about is you end up creating this vision advantage. You end up being able to see what everybody else sees, but you find things that others don't. That's the art of, again, finding that sharp insight over and over again. And it's, quite frankly, it's a competitive business advantage if you've created that vision advantage. But to your point, it has to start with embracing that internally, that you want a team and a group of individuals that is always asking questions and trying to dig deeper, and making sure you have people that understand that the experience they have in the world isn't necessarily someone else's, right? And that they have a level of curiosity, which, by the way, I believe you can strengthen, just like working out, right? I think you can continue to work on your own curiosity on that. But yeah, so it's well said, and something I wholeheartedly believe in.
I read a lot of books, and I spend a lot of time telling people which books not to read because I don't think they're worth their time. But I wholeheartedly recommend and would urge anyone who, I mean, everyone. I was going to say anyone who works in marketing or branding or products, but I think there are so many lessons to be learned from this book. So thank you for writing it. And if there was one lesson that you'd like people to take away from Emotion by Design, what would it be?
Wow, that if there's just one, I do think it's this idea of see what others see, find what others don't. Spend the time, again, in your personal life, in your professional life, because oftentimes the real insights and the real way people are feeling are invisible on the surface. And so what it means, it gets back to this idea of being a brand that feels personal. And if you're going to be a brand that feels personal, you must embrace creativity and cultivate a creative culture, because I think that's how you're really able to use empathy within the creative problem solving process. Because what it means is you're getting under the surface of an individual, a community, a city, even the whole world. You're asking those questions and you're trying to figure out, how do we connect what we sell with what the world needs at a given point in time? And how do we close that distance? And so that's what I would say is, at the end of the day, see what others see, but find what others don't. Spend that time, embrace empathy, be curious, get outside yourself, right? And I just think there's so much opportunity out there.
Thank you so much. Finally, we're of course talking on behalf of the Journey Further Book Club. So, if you were able to recommend one book that's not your own to the members, to the brand marketers, the senior marketers that make up our community, what would it be?
Well, there is a book on that idea of brand elements. The book called Insanely Simple by Ken Siegel. And Insanely Simple, really, he was on the agency side during the rise of Apple, right? Especially in the years where they're bringing out the iPhone and the iPad and iTunes. And so Insanely Simple really gets back to that idea of make it as simple as possible, but not simpler. Like Apple mastering this idea of less is more and obsessing the details. And he takes you behind the scenes within the process of achieving that. But he's also giving you, a lot of principles that are applicable regardless. You don't have to work within the software and tech space, right? These are this idea of insanely simple, and the principles that make it up can be used by everybody. And I think we need more of that in the world, right, is sharing, and that idea of, we all come together to rise higher. And so that would just be a book that I would throw out there.
That's amazing. I'll be checking it out immediately. Thank you so much for your time, Greg. Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to speak to you, and thank you for writing Emotion by Design.
Thank you, Isabelle, and thank you to everyone at the book club. And it's just, I've really enjoyed the conversation and the questions. And best of luck to everybody as we look ahead into 2022.